People think debts are paid with money, but the powerful know the truth. Debts are paid with people. And that night, Evelyn Rose was about to find out exactly who her family had turned in. 1. She woke with a start, her heart pounding as if trying to escape her chest. Evelyn Rose sat up as if pulled by an invisible thread. She woke with the taste of metal on her tongue and a folded note pressed into the lining of her purse. "You owe me." No signature, no apology meant. Evelyn Rose sat up as if pulled by a wire. The room tilted. A perfume she didn't wear clung to the sheets. Her memory came back in shards. The velvet darkness of a private suite, a man with hands that were too steady, laughter behind a glass wall, a voice saying her name like an accusation. Damian Cole. The name landed like a stone. She had hated it and feared it in the same breath. She reached for her phone. 9 missed calls. 1 text. "We need 50,000. Call now." Her heartbeat doubled. $50,000 for what? A wrong number? But then the next text gave the shape of it. Leo. Hospital. Urgent. Leo, her son, who was 9 and loved superheroes and pancakes with too much syrup, who had fallen off the neighbor's fire escape 2 weeks ago and now was fragile and frightened. She ran a hand through her hair, found a smear of powder on her wrist, a bruise like a crescent on the inside of her arm. Panic pushed into the space where sleep should have been. She dressed with hands that trembled and drove as if part of the city had turned into a tunnel. The hospital smell hit before she saw him. Antiseptic, lemon cleaner, the hollow sound of machines. Leo lay on a bed, pale, a cast on his arm like a punishment, his small face slack with exhaustion. Dr. Wilson hovered with that practiced concern doctors have when money is the divider. "We stabilized him," the doctor said. "He's going to need intensive rehab, physical therapy, surgeries if needed. It will be expensive. We don't want to alarm you, but—" He swallowed. "You'll need about 50,000 as an immediate deposit." 50,000. Evelyn's knees almost went. She thought of the rent, of overdue electricity notices, of the grocery bags she tried to hide under the sink. She thought of nights washing dishes until her arms ached, of the second job at the diner, of the look of pity that strangers who knew about her situation gave her on buses. 50,000 was a sum that existed on the wrong side of every ledger she had. Outside, a black sedan idled like a rumor. When she stepped into the corridor, a woman in an expensive coat approached her with a folder. "Ms. Rose," the woman said, crisp, rehearsed. "Cole Group will cover the immediate hospital expenses. We can arrange payment plans for longer-term treatments." Evelyn looked at the woman's manicured nails, at the logo on the folder, an embossed C that seemed to own the light, and then at the hallway's fluorescent glare. "Why? Her voice cracked. "I never signed anything." The woman's smile was thin. "Mr. Cole has expressed concern. He insisted." There was a pause, a calculation. "We'll need some information to process it." There are favors, and there are favors with strings. Evelyn understood both by instinct now. She had seen how debt bowed people, how gratitude could be weaponized into obligation. She clutched the note she had found in her purse and felt the weight of the night press down like a verdict. At the edge of the corridor, someone cleared their throat. He was taller than the woman, built so that he almost seemed to prevent air from moving. Damian Cole. He had the rare quality of being both utterly composed and dangerously unreadable. In photographs, he looked like a cover for a story no one was allowed to open. Up close, his face was the map of consequences. "Miss Rose," he said, as if their meeting were an unremarkable thing in a predictable day. His voice was low, careful. It could have been kindness. It could have been command. Evelyn's memory refused to hand him over cleanly. She had gone to the party for the job lead, an interview opportunity that had promised fresh starts. She'd told herself it was networking. She'd stood in a room full of wine and leather, of people who wore success like armor. She had accepted a glass pressed into her hand. After that, time blurred. She remembered a man's shadow bending close, a whispered joke, the prick of something shoved into her drink. She remembered waking in a bed that smelled of cigars and wealth, and the crush of shame and fear that followed like hunger. "Why are you here?" she said now. Damian's eyes flicked to Leo, then back. "You called to the hospital the night he was admitted," he said. The memory of that night came, the call she had made when she realized Leo had fallen and she had no way to pay for an ambulance, the way hands had reached from unexpected pockets. "I asked to be informed." Evelyn's laugh was a broken thing. "You asked?" "You owe me," said something in the hallway, like a whisper. Someone was listening. Damian's jaw tightened. He stepped closer until the space between them was a statement. "We'll cover the immediate payments," he said, "but I need you to cooperate with us. The company will offer you a temporary position, administrative. You'll have access to the employee health plan for Leo. It's better than what you can get on your own." She wanted to say no. She wanted to say that someone could not buy a child's safety with a job that bought his silence. She wanted to spit and walk away with her dignity intact. Instead, she nodded, because there had been a night, and there had been a bruise and a scent of perfume, and, above all, Leo thrumming beneath her ribs in the hospital bed like a small sun, and sunlit certainty could not be bartered away. That night marked her entry into a world she had only glimpsed through headlines and overheard conversations in laundromats. The Cole Group offices were a glass reef inside the city, all steel and polished boredom, a habitat for people who counted in millions. Evelyn's first day on the payroll was a humiliation disguised as employment. She sat at a thin desk in a canyon of voices, answering phones with practiced cheer while the company celebrated anniversaries in rooms with velvet ropes. The badge around her neck felt like a shackle. Sophia found her quickly. Sophia always found the newcomers. She wore jealousy like couture, sharp shoulders, a laugh that cut through the air, and she had eyes that cataloged vulnerability as if it were entertainment. "Oh, you're the woman from the hospital," Sophia said the very first day, as if adding the note to an inventory list. "We were all wondering how someone like you got the ear of a Cole." A small audience circled. People like to watch when someone is being sorted into the hierarchy. Evelyn felt the heat of their stares. It was the same heat that follows people walking down a public staircase with too many bags. She kept her voice flat. "I need this job," she said. It was not an apology. It was a declaration. Sophia's smile narrowed. "We all do, darling. Some of us just do not parade our problems." The words implied 1,000 polite cruelties. Evelyn looked down at her hands. They had fingernails chewed to the quick from nights of worry. She had promised herself she would not cry here, not under fluorescent lights. Damian watched from the periphery, like a god watching the tides. He offered nothing that day except an occasional nod. But the rumor machine in the office churned, whispers attached to his name like barnacles. People speculated. Was he simply generous? Was he indebted to guilt? Was there a secret written into his step? Money moved, doors opened, and Evelyn reminded herself with every small kindness that it was Leo she was saving. She learned new ways to keep her head down. She learned to smile at office parties and decline wine. She learned to accept a scarf from a receptionist as if it were charity. When Leo's treatment started, they revealed more than the physical damage. He had lost part of his confidence, the easy lightness of a child who trusted the world. He flinched at sudden movements, woke from nightmares, and refused to ride a bike. His therapist, a patient woman who smelled of chamomile, told Evelyn quietly that recovery would be long and complicated. "There will be setbacks," she said. "We need to build safety around him." Safety required money. It required time that Evelyn did not possess. It required an employer who could pay for specialist sessions and classes that cost more than a month's rent. Cole Group's insurance covered some things. It didn't cover Leo's emotional scars. At the monthly gala, an event of plated silver and veiled conversation, where the city's most influential people reclined like predators, Evelyn was asked to serve canopies as part of her job. They dressed her in a black dress that felt borrowed and a smile she practiced in the mirror. The room was warm with perfume and power. The VIP area smelled of costly scotch and perfumed ego. Sophia floated between tables like a contralto in a cruel opera, her movement designed to draw eye and opinion. She saw Evelyn with a tray and decided to place a mark. "You weren't supposed to be here," Sophia murmured loudly, so that those nearby could hear. "Someone told me a story last week about a woman who left the party in a taxi with one of our guests. Strange coincidence that she's now on our payroll." Glass froze in hands. Conversations throttled. Evelyn felt each word like a brand. "I'm here to work," she said, her voice small. "I'm here because Leo needs money," Sophia said, smiling with the precision of a trap. "And apparently Mr. Cole has a soft spot for misplaced mothers." A man laughed, the sound like metal sliding. Someone took a photograph. Evelyn in a cheap dress holding a tray, Leo's name on every tongue. The room rearranged itself as if in a play, each person placing their part. Damian stepped between them then. He had that effect. Some people became invisible in his presence, others shrank. "Sophia," he said quietly. There was steel under the velvet of his voice. "That will be enough." Sophia's smile did not waver. "Of course," she said, but the point had been delivered. Evelyn tasted bile. When she returned to the hospital later that night, the tabloids were already piecing the story together. The headline on an online site read, "CEO's Night of Mystery. Woman linked to family scandal employed by Cole Group." Evelyn clicked the article open as if it were a punch. The image ran large. A grainy photo from the gala, Damian standing beneath a marquee, Evelyn in the foreground, her eyes not yet bearing the world's new weight. Rumors are economical. They cost nothing to create and are infinitely profitable to spread. They made spaces smaller for Evelyn. She found doors locked when she needed them open and received messages from landlords reminding her of late rent with a civility that felt like a threat. Then, one night, someone arrived at Leo's door. He was small, thin, a courier of bad news with a cap pulled low. "Package for Miss Rose," he said, and extended a sealed envelope. Inside, a photograph. Evelyn and Damian, arm in arm, a private suite's dim light curling around them. Another note, typed, cold. "Keep the story quiet. You're expendable." Whoever had taken the photograph hadn't needed a camera. They needed a permission, a confirmation. They wanted the currency of shame. Evelyn pressed the photograph to her chest, as if the paper could squelch the noise. She wanted to burn it. She wanted to hold it up like evidence. Instead, she read the words and saw in them a map of leverage. It was a pattern she knew well. Power used shame like a leash. Those who had it could clip it on and tug when they needed silence. She folded the photograph into the envelope again and carried it as a reminder. Nothing about this would be simple. As weeks blurred, Damian's behaviors were a country of contradictions. He would show up at the hospital with a briefcase and a check, as if assistance could be cashed into absolution. He would stand in the doorway and glance at Leo and then at Evelyn and then simply walk away, leaving her to interpret the absence. Once, when she caught him staring in a crowded corridor, he gave the smallest lift of the hand. That was all, a breeze. There were other players. Damian Cole, the patriarch, moved like a weather system. He had the appetite of a man who believed the world owed him continuity. When the board met in rooms lined with oil paintings and the city bowed at their feet, Daniel began to speak of heirs in a language that sounded like hunger. Blood, he told the family, clarifies everything. It was Daniel's obsession of securing a bloodline that sharpened into action. When whispers of Elder Cole's advanced age and need for a successor met the rumor of a child linked to his heir, suddenly everyone had an angle. Board members who had been casual about the company's future became fervent. Lawyers sniffed. Sophia's smile found teeth. Evelyn felt the current pull her without permission. Everything that attached to her son's name became a bidding war. She met with human resources and signed forms that felt like handcuffs. She sat in meetings where words like arrangement and placement were used to describe her life. Tom, the HR manager with a beer belly that had once carried him through better days, nodded in a way that suggested sympathy, but his eyes flicked to the exit like he was measuring escape. "You don't owe them," he said once, a small mercy offered during a break. "Not truly. You owe your son a life." She wanted to reply that she didn't know how to get a life for him without swallowing humiliations, that civil survival required choosing which bones you were willing to bruise. But she listened instead and let the words nestle inside like a seed. The city has a way of making things seem inevitable. You get used to inevitability the way you get used to gray days. You learn the rhythm. Evelyn learned to freelance her dignity. She learned to take benefits where she could find them. She learned to keep Leo's laughter in her pocket like contraband. Then the first attempt happened. Something that smelled of coordination. A van idling across her block late at night. Men who watched the building's lights like a study on motion. Security cameras cut out for 60 seconds. Her neighbor, a man with a broken smile, swore he heard footsteps on the roof, like someone rehearsing regret. Evelyn called the police, and they came with polite concern and too few answers. No one was arrested. The men in the van were ghosts. She thought of those photographs again. She thought of the note in her purse and the casual cruelty of office parties. She thought of Daniel's hunger for an heir, and the way the world was carved up by those who had the nerve to take. Someone wanted her to vanish, maybe for her silence, maybe to cut the thread her existence had tugged on the family tapestry, maybe to make the problem into a story they could own. A week later, at an arbitration meeting arranged by the Cole legal team, Evelyn was told she had options. One option was relocation, somewhere distant, with a stipend and months of therapy promised, in return for limited contact and a non-disclosure agreement. Another was a minimal severance and continued exposure. The word relocation tasted like exile. Damian's assistant placed a manila envelope on the table and slid it toward her. Inside, an address, a plain itinerary, a lump sum large enough to reset her life if she would take it. "You would be safer," the man said, his voice low, parenthetical, "away from prying eyes, away from those who might see your presence as a threat." Whoever drew this map assumed a simple arithmetic. Remove the inconvenient variable, and the equation returns to balance. Evelyn sat and thought of Leo's small fingers curled around hers. She thought of the photograph pressed against the underside of her mind. She thought of the van across her building. She thought of the threats in the notes and the men in the shadows, and the way her work at Cole had become a gilded treadmill. That night, she packed. She tried to make it a brave thing. She folded Leo's shirts and placed his sneakers into a bag with the care of someone performing a ritual for a child she needed to protect. She tried to explain what they were doing to him in a voice that was both firm and tender. "We're going on a trip," she said. "A long trip, just you and me. We'll get better there." Leo's face dissolved into confusion and trust in a single breath. He was all bright faith, the kind only children are allowed. "Are we going on an airplane? Will there be cookies?" She kissed his forehead and pretended she believed in the plane and the cookies. On the morning they left, the city was wet with rain, and the sky looked like a sheet pulled tight. She hailed a cab. Damian's name thrummed in her pocket like a coin she had not asked to possess. In the rearview mirror, the driver glanced at her hands and did not ask questions he didn't expect answers for. The hospital had given her a folder of paperwork. The airline stamped tickets with indifferent satisfaction. At the security gate, the man who had once been an HR official, Tom, handed her a typed note. "If you need help," it read, "call the number here." He pressed the paper into her palm with a gravity like apology. She tucked it into her coat like a protection charm. They flew to a small city where no one knew the shape of her history. They moved into an apartment with sun that leaked into the kitchen. The rent was part of the stipend. The neighborhood smelled like bread and laundry. For a few weeks, the world felt small enough to hold. Leo learned to walk without flinching. He discovered a playground with a slide that felt like triumph. Her phone buzzed less with messages that felt like threats. She made pancakes and turned the radio to a station that played songs that were less vicious. But the city is full of mirrors. News comes in slow, invasive waves. A column appeared in a gossip tabloid about a woman once connected to Damian Cole spotted at an airport. The photograph showed a part of Evelyn's cheek and a bag. Someone in a comment section labeled her a gold digger. The article was an attempt to reframe a narrative that had already been written in someone else's hand. And so, quietly, the war resumed. One night, a man arrived at the apartment door with an envelope under his arm. He wore a suit that cost as much as Evelyn earned in a year. He did not knock. He pressed the envelope into her hands with something that was almost pity. "Miss Cole?" he asked, as if they were discussing a new hire. His mouth said Ms. Cole, his eyes said Evelyn. He smiled like a man who'd been born into a hall of ancestors and knew exactly where to set his foot. Evelyn opened the envelope later. Inside, an official-looking letter from the Cole legal team. They wanted DNA samples. It was not explicit why, only that family records needed clarification, and for the administrative process to proceed, Ms. Rose would need to cooperate. DNA. The word landed like a verdict. It was a thing that could make or break people here, a saline proof that transferred power from rumor to law. She felt suddenly very small beneath its weight. She thought of the night and the bruise and the perfume. She thought of the van, of the coldness of the notes. She went to bed with the envelope on the nightstand, and Leo curled beside her like an anchor. Weeks later, at a small clinic with a polite technician and the sterile smell of antiseptic, they took a swab. Leo giggled like it was a game. Evelyn tasted metal again, but now it was fear. The samples were sealed and placed into a system that removed her from the moment and put her into a future where science would translate her into a file number. She tried to sleep. In the dark, the city muttered like an old neighbor telling gossip. In the morning, there was a call from a private number. "Ms. Rose?" Damian's voice, careful, controlled. "I am sorry for the intrusion. We will expedite the process." Evelyn wanted to say, "Your intrusion cost me everything." Instead, she asked, "Why now? Why me?" "There are forces moving," he answered. "My grandfather is ill. His concern for his lineage has become urgent." There was a faint exhale, almost human. This is about the future of the company and, of course, the child. For a moment, his words revealed the map behind their lives. Daniel Cole's hunger had become a current, a force that pulled at hands and bank accounts. It clarified motives. Evelyn's name began to travel like a dossier through offices and legal chambers. It was no longer simply a mistake or a rumor. It was documentation and possibility. To some, she was a threat to be neutralized. To others, she was an inconvenient proof that might be used for their own ends. Then the city played another hand. A man, unknown to Evelyn, produced a recording, surveillance from a private lot, that showed her leaving a private vehicle on the night in question. The clip was grainy, but the angle suggested intimacy. The tabloids called it evidence. The board called it confirmation. In the meantime, a new rumor grew, that Evelyn had disappeared, left town when things became hot. She had not disappeared. She had been advised to leave for her safety. That word advised felt like a hollow shield. The arrangement was made to look like a kindness. In truth, it was a containment. They moved her to a coastal town 3 hours away, where the sea made a proper edge and the streets closed at dusk. No one from the Cole group spoke of compulsion. They offered platitudes and envelopes, schedules and contacts. Her exile looked like charity and felt like a sentence. At home, in their rented apartment, Leo ran a small hand along a map they'd pinned to the wall. He had traced continents with crayons, unaware that maps can be used to navigate justice as well as landscapes. Evelyn spread out paper on the table and tried to make plans that would allow him to heal and keep them out of harm's path. In the whitewashed quiet of their coastal refuge, she received a text from an unknown number. "Watch your back." She did not tell Leo. She folded the phone into a drawer and breathed. Sometimes, to survive, you must hand your life over to midnight arrangements and trust that you will hold enough of your truth to reclaim it later. She told herself this as if the phrase could be a talisman. But the thing about being removed from the center of power is that power does not dissolve. It simply rearranges itself around you. Daniel's insistence on an heir ignited conversations in the company's inner circles that they once only whispered when drunk. Board members jostled for position. Sophia sharpened her knives. The man in the van became a rumor. The photograph took on new weight. Evelyn watched from a distance and felt like an animal watched by those who had the right to name it. One afternoon, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside, a photograph of Damian on a yacht, a woman in his arms. Not her, but the image suggested a pattern. The note scrawled across it read, "They want control. They will play games. Don't play." The sender had left a phone number and no name. Evelyn considered calling. Instead, she folded the photograph and put it in a box by the moving boxes labeled Leo's toys. She spent that night sitting on the kitchen floor, the salt wind hitting the windows, and thought about how power feels like a weather system, constant, patient, inevitable, and how she, a woman rebuilt of small acts and stubbornness, felt like a single tree in a field. Meanwhile, in the Cole mansion, conversations that mattered were being held under chandeliers. Daniel paced like a man rehearsing disaster. "We need certainty," he said to the board. "Blood ties matter. The company is not safe without them." Sophia listened and placed her cheek against her palm. "And how certain are you?" she asked. Her voice held steel. She wanted confirmation that a newcomer's child could unravel her ascent. She wanted to close ranks and push Evelyn into the category of memory. Damian sat beside his grandfather like a man between two mirrors, practical, cold, and sometimes unexpectedly remorseful. He had made choices in the name of efficiency and social order. He had also, at times, opened a door to help a man walk through. He did not see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a man who kept his family intact even when it meant bending others. And that was the problem with men who thought their actions were just. They often failed to see the damage they left. Back in the coastal town, Evelyn received a call from a lawyer whose name she did not know. "The Cole lawyers have requested your presence," he said. "They want to discuss the results of the DNA." Her stomach dropped. The test had been taken weeks ago. She had been told to expect a wait. For a long moment, she listened to the sea's sound through the phone, as if the world could be recalibrated by the horizon. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow, at their office." They wanted her back. She looked at Leo asleep on the sofa, a blanket tucked up to his chin, and felt a new kind of dread. Coming back to the city meant stepping onto ground where every step could be a chess move for someone else. It meant headlines, cameras, legal proceedings, and people who wanted their secrets guarded. It meant that the night that had started this chain of events, 2 bodies in a private room, would be pulled apart in cold light. She pushed away the blankets, packed a small bag, and made a list of things she could and could not say. She rehearsed answers like prayers. Sometimes you prepare for a storm by learning where to stand. Evelyn had learned that truth and safety rarely overlapped. Sometimes they were inverse measures. But she would go. She had to. Leo's name hung in the air like a promise she could not abandon. The city felt colder when they returned. The Cole Group building rose like a machine. Cameras dotted the lobby like insects. She walked the path they had measured for her, flanked by legal aides and watched by faces that had already decided their verdict. At the office, the conference room smelled of leather and air-conditioned certainty. Damian sat at the head of the table like a man posting a notice. Daniel was present in spirit through a call that linked him to the room. Sophia sat with folded hands, a composure like a mask. Tom stood at the edge, fingers tapping like a man seeking salvage. The lawyer laid out the test in clinical language. "The results indicate a high probability of relatedness," she said. "However, the process moves through legal channels for confirmation. There are options for custody, guardianship, and an arrangement that would place the child within the company's care as an heir." Evelyn's chair felt to her like something she had climbed into and could not climb out of. "He's my son," she said. It wasn't a plea. It was a fact she hoped the world was built to respect. "Ms. Rose," Damian said, "this is not about taking. It's about protecting the lineage and the company." The words were practiced. He used them like a shield. She thought of the photograph in her purse, of the note, "You owe me." She thought of the van and the men on the roof. She thought of Dr. Wilson's measured concern and Tom's private sympathy. She thought of Daniel's hands that had probably never been dirtied and how they wanted proof of blood to reinforce a legacy. Sophia's eyes shone with something uncontained. "A child linked to the heir changes everything," she said. "It delays engagements, reallocates shares, alters succession. We cannot be left in uncertainty." There was something in Sophia's voice like hunger. It was not a hunger for the company. It was a hunger for power's comforts to remain where she thought they belonged. She feared displacement. The conversation became a carousel of legalities, a show of offers and counteroffers. The lawyers suggested guardianship in the company's trust, a financial plan for Leo's care, a monitored visitation schedule for Evelyn. They offered protections and envelopes and a life that would be comfortable as long as it complied. Evelyn listened. She watched their calculation of her as if it were an object to be appraised. They offered her stability as a cost of obedience. When the meeting ended, Damian walked her to the elevator. They stood in the hum of corporate art and distant laughter. He looked at her with a complexity she could not name. Remorse? Resignation? A man who knew how to close doors and also how to leave them open when it served him. "You don't have to accept anything," he said, and for once there was an odd softness. "We can work something out that protects your position and Leo's." She wanted to ask him why her life was a lever he could move without asking. She wanted to tell him about the note, the photograph, the men on the roof. She wanted to ask whether there had been any apology for the night, any acknowledgement of what he had done. She swallowed these questions until they turned into stones in her throat. Instead, she said, "I want what's best for my son." "Of course," he answered. Outside, cameras blinked like stars. The city hadn't finished with them. Power had a way of speaking last. That night, a call came from an unknown number. "We have eyes on you," said a voice that had been instructed not to feel. "You will be safer if you comply." Evelyn hung up and looked at Leo, whose breath was small and regular in sleep. She had been told to leave before, advised to take the stipend, counseled to accept being kept. But now there was another feeling rising under everything, an ember that wanted to be a controlled fire. She did not trust those who told her life was safer through relocation. She did not trust those who sold security at the price of her autonomy. She resolved then, in the stillness, to hold on to what she could. She would not bow to anonymous threats. She would not cede her story to those who thought power meant ownership. She would not let the map of her life be redrawn by those who dealt in heirs and legacies. And yet, as the night deepened, someone knocked on her door. A late knock that was neither polite nor urgent, but a measured presence. She opened the door expecting a neighbor, a courier, a mistake. Instead, there stood Tom, his face pale. Behind him, another figure loomed, an official-looking man with a badge and no smile. "Miss Rose," Tom said, his voice brittle, "there are allegations. We have a warrant. Evelyn shut the door. She didn't open it again. She packed a bag with hands that trembled and moved through the apartment like a woman performing a ritual to save a small life. She scooped up Leo, kissed his forehead, and left through a back stair, because city staircases teach you how to move without being noticed. She had planned for the exile. She had planned for the move. She had not planned for this, an accusation that meant being dragged into visibility with all the weight of the company's enormous inertia behind it. They moved in the night. She left behind a stack of medical bills and a kitchen clock that had once belonged to her grandmother. She left behind a life that had been small and honest, and now was the axis of other people's games. She carried only what she could, and Leo's hand in hers. She thought she was leaving safety in one pocket and taking refuge in the other. She did not know whether anyone would find them, whether the photograph would be used to frame them, whether the DNA would be weaponized or vindicated. She did not know that the man who opened and closed doors at the Cole Group would watch from the tower of his life and begin to count the cost of a secret that refused to stay buried. On the ferry out of the city, wind pulling at her coat, Evelyn felt the world collapse and reshape itself in a single breath. She felt small and sovereign in equal measure. She was being pushed into an exile dressed as protection. She told herself she would learn to live inside the forced margin. She promised herself that one day she would return. She did not yet understand that her return would be the thing to split the house of Cole open. She only knew that for now she would hide, gather, and survive. If this story is gripping and you want the full saga, subscribe. New episodes drop weekly. They reached the coastal house just before dawn. The place had been arranged by a woman with a soft voice who promised privacy and stability. The first morning was white with fog. Leo played with a toy car on the floor, his laughter fragile and bright, and Evelyn watched him as if he were a keepsake she had rescued from a flood. She would not be safe forever. The world she had left pulsed with plans. Daniel's appetite would not be sated by distance. Sophia's vendetta would not be dulled by sea breezes. Damian would continue to move within his realm, and sometimes his shadow would cross her path like a tide. But for now, she had a small room that smelled of lemon. She made tea and planned the day. She called the number Tom had given her and listened to a voice that promised to help if she needed to return. Days passed. The coastal town's rhythms were slower. People smiled without calculation. Leo learned to climb a small hill that looked like triumph. Evelyn slept and woke and tried to stitch routine into their days. Yet in the back of her mind, a file stamped Cole Group pressed like a stone. She had seen the way endings had a habit of being rearranged into beginnings for other people. She thought of a list: DNA tests pending, photos in the wrong hands, anonymous threats, a patriarch obsessed with heirs, a rival hungry for power, a CEO whose touch could offer both savior and captor. She could not yet see the shape of her return. She could not yet measure how her presence would make the house she'd vanished from tremble. But she began to gather small things, evidence of who she was, a journal filled with their life before the company's reach, receipts, photographs, proof that would one day be a lever. She learned to say no at phone calls that sounded like offers. She learned to pack and fold and be ready to move because stability here was thin. And while she waited, the company moved on the other side of the city like a patient predator. Boards met, lawyers argued. Sophia smiled and schemed. Damian, who had the power to erase reputations and buy silence, watched his grandfather and began to understand that the property of secrecy can be a fragile thing when it meets a mother's stubbornness. On a day when the sea was silver and the gulls were loud, Evelyn read a small article on the internet, a short split between gossip and the city's magazine, announcing that a woman with links to Damian Cole had vanished months prior. The tone suggested that some disappearances were convenient, some were careful. The headline hinted that the story would be forgotten tomorrow. Evelyn stood and closed the laptop. She fingered the photograph of Leo as a baby and thought about how things that change hands rarely remain the same after the exchange. She began to imagine a return, not as a plea, but a force. The idea was fierce: to come back and make the ledger honest, to show the world that a child belonged to himself and not to the currency of a family empire. She did not yet know how she would do it. She only knew she would hold the line. Across the water, in the city's towers of glass, plans were being sharpened so that nothing unpredictable could threaten the dynasty. Yet rumors travel on their own. There were whispers of a missing woman who might be more than a problem. There were suggestions that the patriarch's ultimatum could trigger a chain reaction that none of them wanted to see. And so, in a room that smelled of lemon and safety that could not be guaranteed, Evelyn began to lay the groundwork for what every mother hopes for: a future in which her child's name is not a bargaining chip. She began to rehearse her return, as if practicing to reclaim territory that had never truly been theirs to redistribute. The tide, she thought, can be predicted but not controlled. She would not let power teach her son how to fear. She would not let the past remain shackled to other people's definitions. She would not let the past remain a thing that other men could trade like currency. She would return, she thought, not as supplicant, but as a force with teeth. Weeks of planning began in small gestures: calls to the lawyer whose number Tom had given her, furtive meetings with an investigative journalist who owed her a favor from a story about housing evictions, and the quiet assembling of documents, receipts, birth certificates, an old photograph of a woman in a hospital uniform whose face resembled Evelyn's in a way that made her throat close. Each piece was a stitch in a map back to the city she had left, a map she planned to use carefully, like a weapon that was also a shield. Damian watched from the other side of the glass. The Cole family's world was a machine that survived on the illusion of control. When control faltered, men in rooms with oak tables spoke in low voices and tried to rewrite the ledger. Daniel's health worsened. His impatience with uncertainty hardened into open demands. "Find the proof," he commanded. "Whatever it takes, find the inheritance." Sophia multiplied her moves. She cultivated board allies, leaked inconvenient tidbits to tabloids, and whispered fear into the ears of those who still held old grievances. Her image operated like a blade, small enough to slit reputations, precise enough to remove obstacles. She pressed the company's legal apparatus to limit Evelyn's options, non-disclosure proposals, agreements that would place Leo into a trust that would be managed by a committee she and her allies favored. Then a thread frayed. A lab technician in the city, fed up with anonymous manipulation, leaked a chain of custody irregularity to the journalist Evelyn had met. The leak was small and bureaucratic, an early sign really, but it broke the neat order that Sophia and the board had assumed. Evelyn's legal team used it. They commissioned a second, independent DNA analysis with strict oversight. It took time. It took money they did not have, which is why the lawyer had insisted on a payment plan and a small retainer he said would be an investment in evidence. Evelyn found that evidence rarely arrives like a lightning bolt. It usually arrives in small, tedious ways: stamped receipts, courier confirmations, a technician's signature. She signed forms and passed swabs into the hands of people who were not interested in the politics that had birthed her. She did it because she had learned the arithmetic of survival. Paper could be a weapon when the battlefield was a room where lawyers made offers. They planned her return to the city like a quiet operation, not a storm, but a strategic opening. The journalist was sworn to discretion. His editor had the appetite for a story that could break the Cole family's monopoly on whispered power. The lawyer secured a hearing, a place where the independent results would be entered into the record. Meanwhile, Evelyn arranged to come back at the time of the Cole Group's annual gala, when the family's attention would be on celebration and cameras would already be present. It was risky. It was perfect. The night of the gala arrived with a low wind that smelled of rain. The city's elite gathered under chandeliers and soft lights. The invitation list was a spell, names that signified access, marriages, mergers. Damian stood at the head of the room like a man who bore the authority to make or unmake evenings. Daniel watched from a wing chair, his breath measured, a glass of scotch held like a talisman. Sophia circulated like a queen bee, her smile a weapon. Evelyn arrived late, escorted by a lawyer and 2 security professionals. She wore a dress that did not try to hide what she had been, no attempt at mimicry of their opulence. It was clean, honest, and unadorned. She moved through the room like a fact. Cameras angled, conversations paused. She stood near the periphery as speeches were made and applause cascaded. Her presence was a splinter in a varnished surface. Damian saw her, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt toward him. The flash of cameras increased, the air tightened. At exactly the moment the editor of a major paper, an ally to Evelyn's cause, rose to make a pre-arranged announcement, the room's micro-ecosystem changed. The editor's voice was clear, formal, and unflinching. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we were recently provided with newly verified DNA results that bear on a matter many of you have read about. In the interest of public truth, we will share them now." Heads turned. The murmuring that follows a scandal began to collect like birds. Evelyn felt the sound as something tangible against her skin. She imagined, for a fraction of a second, turning and running. Instead, she stood and folded her hands because she had nothing left to do but watch the moment she had been building toward. The document the editor held was not sensational in its typography. It was clinical, laboratory letterhead, signatures, a statement of methods, and statistical probabilities. It spoke in measured language, a high probability of biological relatedness between Leo and the Cole line, an even higher probability that Evelyn shared a common maternal lineage with a known Cole surname recorded in family archives decades ago. Silence swallowed the room. Daniel's face blanked, then reddened, then settled like a man forced to remember a face he had seen and chosen to forget. Sophia's lips thinned. The edges of her composure began to fray. Damian's hand tightened into a fist at his side. He watched Evelyn as if watching for some sign of theatrics. There was none. There was only the slow, inexorable recoil of a dynasty discovering that the ledger had been wrong. Someone, Sophia, the press hinted, had already prepared a counterstrike. Her allies began to whisper about chain of custody, about possible contamination, about motivation. The narrative engine started up again, as it always does, grinding both accusation and doubt. The gala had become both stage and courtroom. Evelyn moved then, not toward the microphones, but to the seat near the front where the Cole family sat. She crossed the polished floor with a steadiness that surprised even her. Cameras followed. Damian stood as she approached, his posture a careful question. "You didn't have to come tonight," he said softly, the crowd falling into a hush because the sound suggested a private exchange. "You left me with notes and photos," she replied, the words carrying like a bell. "You used my son to make decisions about my life. I came so the world could see what that looks like when someone tries to carve a child out of a family for profit." There were gasps. Daniel's features tightened into a mask of ruin and insistence. He had spent years believing that lineage could be purified into a plan. Now that plan presented a person who did not fit the geometry of his estate. Then, unexpected, the editor walked back to the microphone and added a line he had arranged with Evelyn's team. "There is an additional document we have in our possession that pertains to the family records. It's a birth ledger entry from 31 years ago with a name matching the surname of Miss Rose's maternal line. The ledger confirms a record of a child named Helena registered briefly in the Cole Family Hospital before the name was marked as transferred. The transfer paperwork is incomplete. We are making both documents available." The room vibrated with the sound of other people's breath. For a beat that felt like a bell ringing between heartbeats, the family's old secrecy lay exposed on paper. Evelyn felt something ancient uncoil in her. A memory of lullabies in a room that had been tiny and luminous. A woman in a nurse's uniform whose eyes resembled her own. A locket with a crest she had found among her mother's papers and had always thought of as a keepsake. The name Helena slotted into her like a missing tooth sliding home. "You are saying," Daniel began, but his voice failed him. He had crafted stories about heirs and lines and blood, but had not anticipated the jolt of a name he had buried in the family ledger. Sophia moved then, fast as an animal trained to survive. "This is manipulation," she snapped. "This is a stunt. We will demand further testing. We will not—" Her words ended in a sound like a bite. A riot of shouts broke out at the back of the room. Someone had shoved a cameraman. A bottle had been spilled. Staff began to scatter. The noise gave cover to movement. Two men lurched from the crowd toward the edge of Evelyn's presence. They were quick, practiced. A hand grabbed Leo, then let go. A body came between them. Security closed in. The men were wrestled to the floor. The room erupted into a fury of accusations and shouting, but the most important thing had happened. The attempted removal had failed. Someone had been plotting to make Evelyn go quiet, again. This time, they had miscalculated. Sophia's face went white as the men were restrained. Her hands trembled. Then her eyes flashed a calculation that was almost animal. She had not ordered the men to be violent, at least she would deny it, but she had set a machine of rumor and pressure in motion, and a machine had teeth that sometimes bit hands. The arrest that followed was messy and public. The men in custody had ties, loose at first glance, to a private security firm whose invoices had often been rubber-stamped by Cole Group contractors. The details were murky, and the evening became a slow-motion unraveling. Cameras circled like sharks. For a society raised on spectacle, the gala offered its own feast. In the chaos, a reporter shoved a foldable recorder toward Evelyn's face. "Ms. Rose, Helena," she said with performative delicacy, "how do you respond to the claim that you are claiming a name to gain access to Cole assets?" Evelyn looked at the microphone like one looks at a wound. "I respond with the truth," she said simply. "My son needs therapy and medical care. I am his mother. If the Cole family has to reckon with their history, then let them. I did not come for money or revenge. I came so my child could have what he needs." The cameras loved the phrase. Simple, maternal, impossible to spin. It landed like truth on a painted stage. Damian watched, then stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, had a different timbre, closer to apology than command. "This has been mishandled," he said, and even his allies heard the tremor. "If there were irregularities in the handling of evidence, we will address them, but we will not weaponize children." It was an odd declaration, part confession, part protection. His words were met with mixed responses. To some, they were too little, too late. To others, they felt like the necessary caretaking of a damaged machine. To Evelyn, they sounded like a man trying to tend the fires he had lit. The editor announced that independent agencies were being asked to verify the findings. The legal landscape shifted from rumor to paperwork. The city had a way of moving from gossip to record. Once something was in the public ledger, it could no longer be fully erased. That night, after the gala unraveled into an aftertaste of scandal, Evelyn found herself back in a small hotel room with Leo, asleep in the next bed. Her phone hummed with messages, offers, threats, questions. A text arrives from Damian. "I did not know about the van. I will protect you." She did not reply. The next morning, lawyers for both sides convened. An agreement was drafted. The independent DNA results would be submitted to the court, with both parties allowed verified access to chain of custody documentation. A judge placed a temporary protective order around Leo, citing the recent attempted intervention at the gala. Evelyn's legal team secured a clause that prevented the company from relocating Leo or removing him from her care pending the court's decision. The cascade of legal events did not amount to instant victory. The Cole family had lawyers for generations and enough money to make law behave like molasses, slow, predictable, and thick. But legal processes, unlike scandals, are predictable. They require logistics and signatures. They can be navigated. Still, the court's involvement gave Evelyn breathing room to push further. She began looking into the records of the Cole Hospital from decades earlier and found a name sign-in ledger, a faded list of babies born on a certain ward, with a notation near a line, "Helena, transferred under request." The paper smelled like old hospitals and prolonged secrets. There were no clear answers, but the name, the line, the locket she had found in her mother's things, and the independent DNA swabs formed a network of evidence strong enough to strain the family's armor. What no one expected, least of all Evelyn, was the scan that followed that week. She had gone to the doctor for a routine visit after the gala because fatigue had begun to weigh her down. The doctor, a practical woman with tired eyes, asked in passing if Evelyn might be pregnant. The question arrived like a dropped coin. Evelyn's breath stopped. She had never made that possibility a plan. The timeline of the one night and the present was hazy, a fog of memory and shame. Yet the test in the small clinic was unequivocal. She was pregnant. The word rearranged her interior landscape. It transformed stakes into a new geometry. A child was one thing. Children altered inheritances into equations. She learned that one can be simultaneously terrified and oddly, fiercely glad. The image of small hands, of Leo with brothers or sisters, spilled into her thinking like light. She kept the news hidden for a time. It felt private in a world that had been made public. She thought about telling Damian, about asking what the world would be like if it carried his blood, about the long history of men who declared their care by purchasing silence. She also thought about the ways that this life, if it were his, and legality might prove that, could be turned into a tool against her. As the independent lab finalized their chain of custody report, the probability numbers hardened. The official document used phrases like very high likelihood and significant genetic concordance. The court ordered that both parties arrange for a confirmatory test. It would take days. Those days felt like a long, slow count toward an outcome that would change everything. Evelyn found she could use delay to her advantage. Timing in the Cole universe had always belonged to those who manipulated calendars and invitations. She decided the first public moment of truth, when the family and the city would have to reckon, would be staged, on her terms. She informed the editor and chose a day when the court hearing would be public and photographers were expected to be present. The lawyer told her it was risky. The journalist said it was exactly the kind of independence the story needed. She decided she would be honest about Leo, about the night, about her pregnancy, if the law confirmed paternity. The truth, she had learned, was a blade that could cut both ways. But it was her blade, and she would not let others sharpen it without her. The hearing was set in a courthouse with two bright lights. Representatives from the Cole Group arrived in suits that could have paid for Leo's therapy for months. Daniel's presence was felt in the formality of the room. His voice carried through a taped call, and his words had the weight of finality. Sophia arrived like storm clouds, in human form, polished and lethal. The confirmatory test delivered that day was a matter of procedure. Separate labs, stringent controls, signed witnesses. When the clerk read the results aloud, the long stretch of months condensed into 2 sentences. The data indicates with a high degree of certainty that Mr. Damian Cole is the probable biological father of Miss Rose's unborn child, the clerk said. Additionally, the results confirm close genetic ties between Miss Rose and the historical Cole maternity ledger entry for a child registered as Helena. The courtroom reacted like a concert hall after a dissonant chord. Damian's jaw clenched as if someone had touched an old wound. Daniel made a sound that was not quite a cough. Sophia's hands tightened on her folder. After the reading, outside the courthouse, the press assembled like an animal. Questions rained at Evelyn. How did she feel? What did she plan to do? Did she forgive? Was she seeking money? "I want my child to be safe," she said. "I want Leo to be able to walk without fear. I want health care and a life for my children that isn't controlled by the appetites of men who see family as property." The phrasing was simple, and it struck hard. It reframed the argument from one of dynastic numbers to the day-to-day needs of small bodies. The public, with its complicated appetite for scandal and mercy, shifted. Some saw a woman standing for her children. Others saw a threat to a dynasty. The Cole mansion became a theater of emergency meetings. Daniel, brittle and unyielding, demanded that the result be contested. He wanted to bring in more experts, to drag the story into a grid of technicalities. Damian, who had long believed the easiest path was control, found the world recalibrating around a truth he had only half acknowledged. To the shareholders and the board, this was a liability. To the family, it was a reckoning. Sophia, sensing her own position at risk, moved to contain the damage. She rallied allies and prepared subpoenas. She insisted on a guardianship plan that would place the children into a trust controlled by a board that included her appointees. Her voice delivered strategy that smelled very little of care. Evelyn, meanwhile, stood in a new light. The legal orders that had secured Leo's temporary custody in her care now expanded into safeguards that prevented the company from imposing a plan without her consent. The court declined to rule on permanent custody pending a longer review. That delay meant nothing was final, but it also meant the Cole Group could not simply reassign a child as if rearranging furniture. The story, however, was not settled. Old families have long memories and long graces for their own. Sophia's campaign did not fade. Instead, it calcified into something uglier, an attempt to demonstrate Evelyn's unfitness through staged confrontations and insinuated allegations. It relied on rumor, on the economy of shame, on the idea that a mother's mistakes can be weaponized to strip her of rights. At the edge of their plans, someone made an error. Sophia, in her eagerness to secure power, overreached. She had authorized an aggressive surveillance campaign to find dirt on Evelyn. One of her operatives, drunk on access and the sense of being useful, sold their notes to a rival, someone who thought the Cole family should not have the last word. The rival handed the files to the journalist allied with Evelyn. The files contained a damning set of communications, emails from Sophia's account to a private security firm mentioning removal and quieting. They did not outline a kidnapping in operational detail, but the intent or the appetite for it was undeniable. When the journalist published the exchanges, the effect was immediate. The public saw not only a dynasty defending itself, but a figure orchestrating moves that skirted the edges of criminality. Sophia's veneer cracked. Board members who had counted on her stability began to step back. Sensing danger, Sophia lashed out. She confronted Evelyn in a crowded hallway on the day the files went public, saying in a voice that could be heard, "You think you can walk into our house and take what's ours?" There were witnesses. Security cameras caught the exchange. Evelyn did not rise to the bait. She walked away because she had learned that eruption was exactly what Sophia hoped for. Sophia's temper snapped later in a private meeting with a woman on the board who had questioned her tactics. The board member left with a headache and an unwillingness to be associated with public scandal. Soon after, legal action was taken against Sophia for authorizing surveillance that crossed legal boundaries. An investigation began. Her influence waned like light through a shutter. It was in the slow fallout from these events that Daniel made his decision. He called a family meeting in the oak-paneled room where the empire's maps had been traced for generations. The family gathered. Shareholders, legal counsel, and the press were kept from the door. Daniel's voice was softer but harder than it had been when he demanded heirs. He spoke of continuity and of the costs of scandal. He spoke of the company's future, which was suddenly precarious. "Blood clarifies," he said, But his voice broke on the last word. It was a man admitting that his dictation of clarity had created chaos. For all his emphasis on lineage, the ledger that defined his world had not considered the human price of fossilized continuity. A child was not a line on a spreadsheet, it was a life. He made a choice that stunned many. He proposed a public acknowledgement of Evelyn, Helena, as a member of the extended family, under carefully crafted terms. He insisted on oversight for the trust, but agreed to allocate funds for Leo's medical care and for the unborn children's welfare. The arrangement required concessions on both sides: a public statement of recognition, the establishment of a trust for the children, and a promise from Daniel that he would not interfere in certain domestic matters. In exchange, the family hoped to heal its image and salvage the succession by turning attention to a managed, visible inclusion rather than a dragged-out legal war. Damian accepted, not entirely out of compassion, but because he recognized the political calculus. A dynasty too publicly in flames is far less durable than one that absorbs scandal with a controlled apology. He was shamed in the press, but not bankrupted by it. Sophia's reputation suffered. Certain board members resigned. The company's shares trembled and then found a new footing. For Evelyn, the terms were complicated. A trust that promised funds for Leo's care, supervised visitation terms that allowed her to remain primary custodian, and a protective clause that barred the company from relocating the children without a court order. The arrangement required concessions on both sides: a public statement of recognition, the establishment of a trust for the children, and a promise from Daniel that he would not interfere in certain domestic matters. In exchange, the family hoped to heal its image and salvage the succession by turning attention to a managed, visible inclusion rather than a dragged-out legal war. Damian accepted, not entirely out of compassion, but because he recognized the political calculus. A dynasty too publicly in flames is far less durable than one that absorbs scandal with a controlled apology. He was shamed in the press, but not bankrupted by it. Sophia's reputation suffered. Certain board members resigned. The company's shares trembled and then found a new footing. For Evelyn, the terms were complicated: a trust that promised funds for Leo's care, supervised visitation terms that allowed her to remain primary custodian, and a protective clause that barred the company from relocating the children without a court order. She accepted, not because she was grateful to the family, but because the legal safety it offered was tangible and immediate: payments for therapy, long-term medical coverage for Leo, and structured financial security for the children. It offered leverage. It offered space to breathe. Then, late, like a bird that arrives after dusk, the clinical report came from the obstetrician. Not only a pregnancy, but triplets. The discovery was not ceremonious. It was an internal flash of numbers on a screen and the doctor's gentle caution. It reshaped the horizon overnight. Triplets altered the math of everything. 3 unborn children with ties to the Cole line were an inheritance that could not be shrugged off as the result of a scandal. For Daniel, the stakes recalibrated into urgent hunger. 3 potential heirs were a wind that could rewrite plans. For Sophia, they were a threat that demanded desperate measures. For Damian, they were both a consequence and a new kind of responsibility. Evelyn did not announce the pregnancy immediately. She let the news sit like a secret stone in her mouth until the family could no longer pretend to ignore it. When she spoke, the city quieted. Her words were plain. "I'm carrying 3, she told the lawyer, then the journalist, then the room that had watched her like an animal. They will not be a bargaining chip. Then Sophia lashed out in the only way left to her: a public smear accusing Evelyn of fraud and of manipulating medical records. The accusation was cold and cynical. It sought to reduce a woman's pregnancy to a plot device. But the claim required evidence. To create it, Sophia's allies tried to manufacture corroboration, manipulated scans, forged notes. They tapped old connections at certain clinics. Their schemes were clumsy and traceable to those who had authorized them. In the end, the attempts to discredit Evelyn were exposed, partly by the journalist who had never lost faith in the story's human truth, partly by internal whistleblowers who had grown tired of the family's appetites. The revelation of the smear attempted on Evelyn swung public sympathy strongly in her favor. The city's appetites turned. Scandal turned into outrage for those who recognized the pattern of powerful people trying to erase inconvenient realities. The public spectacle reached its peak at a hearing where Daniel, exhausted and finally human, stood before a wider world and issued an apology that was less about remorse than about survival. In pursuit of what I thought was continuity, I have been blind to the human cost, he said. The words were enough to settle some tempers and insufficient to heal all wounds. Sophia was pushed out of the inner circle. Her board seat was dissolved amid calls for governance reform. The company announced new oversight committees, ostensibly to prevent the misuse of private security firms. Damian resigned his seat on the operating board, citing a need to focus on personal matters. It was not quite accountability, but it was exposure. For Evelyn, the result was protection that did not come free. Legal safeguards, medical coverage, a public acknowledgement of her name in relation to the Cole family, all of it bought with the cost of entering an orbit she had once fled. But it also provided what she had wanted since the beginning: enough money to afford Leo's therapy without humiliating charity, enough legal muscle to keep him safe, a place from which a mother could plan. She accepted the trust with reservations. The funds arrived in a structured disbursement, envelopes of sanity that allowed her to secure long-term care and to find a stable apartment within the city. The lawyers who wrote the trust were careful to include clauses that kept the children's guardianship under family jurisdiction and subject to court review, a measure that meant the company could not simply redirect the kids like board minutes. The legal world had drawn a fence around their lives. Evelyn stepped within it not because she wanted to cocoon her life in gilded bars, but because a bar with light and legal teeth could keep teeth from gnawing their way into her children's future. Damian visited, sparingly, awkwardly, in a way that resembled care trailing behind obligation. He offered help, financial and otherwise, and at times the gestures looked like restitution folded into necessity. Evelyn accepted what was useful and declined what felt like the purchase of silence. She demanded transparency in medical decisions and promised to hold him to accountability. It was an uneasy bargain. The family, damaged but resilient in their own way, regrouped with new rules. There were resignations, board shuffles, and a public relations overhaul. The Cole dynasty, once certain of its path, now had a variable it could not control: a woman who would not be erased and children who were not willing to be reduced to lines on an estate chart. And yet, the danger did not disappear. Outliers remained: contractors who resented being exposed, a tabloid editor who believed scandal could be monetized further, a disgruntled member of Sophia's network who might still seek retribution. The world that had tried to swallow Evelyn had not changed its appetite. It had merely shifted the menu. In the weeks after the hearings, Evelyn found quiet moments that tasted like ordinary life. Leo learned to ride a bike again, wommaling at first and then steady. He slept through the night more often. The therapy helped him stitch confidence back into his bones. Evelyn made pancakes and learned new recipes to hide vegetables in for the children she hoped would one day join their kitchen table. She bought a small stroller, practical and sturdy, and thought of the ways a child's presence softens even the hardest plans. She kept a journal, a habit she had begun for herself as a way to stay sane. On one page she wrote, "My name is both Evelyn and Helena. It is for me to hold." She understood that names can be claims, and claims can be contested. She also understood that names can be a refuge from those who would use you as a ledger. She vowed to teach her children the difference between being known and being owned. Damian tried to rebuild something with his family. He pressed for measured humility, for governance reform, for financial transparency. He walked a narrow path of responsibility and avoidance. He had to answer to the press and to his grandfather, whose appetite for certainty had not entirely calmed. The old man remained a presence, less a force and more the memory of a force. Sophia, disgraced but not destroyed, retreated to a life of private bitterness. She issued statements of regret that contained no apology and sought to redirect her public image. Some doors closed, others remained slightly ajar for the kinds of people who never found shame easy to sustain. And then, one morning, Evelyn received a document that felt like a small miracle. A birth certificate from the Cole Hospital archives, digitized and signed, that confirmed a name long lost in the ledger, Helena Cole, with a notation about a nurse's request. The paperwork bore the mark of the elderly woman who had been a midwife in the hospital and who, decades ago, had perhaps seen a child she could not keep. For Evelyn, it closed a small circle. For Daniel, it opened a larger one. He called her afterward. The conversation was awkward and contained the weight of a man learning to apologize without a manual. "I am sorry for the ways a family can injure," he said at last. It was not a full absolution, but it was a recognition of something real. Evelyn accepted the document and the apology with caution. She had learned how fragile such things could be. The world had given her protection and had tried to buy her silence. She had taken one and refused the other. She had also learned that power, once wielded, tends to leave marks. Months later, as spring leaned into the city and the trees pushed tentative green through winter gray, Evelyn walked a short stretch with Leo and the image of 3 small futures growing inside of her. The court had approved her continued custody pending the long-term review. The trust provided stability. She had a support network, the journalist who had believed her, a lawyer who had kept his distance professional and humane, a few neighbors who were the small constellations of a real life. At times, she thought about revenge. Anger is an honest thing. But revenge is also a hunger that never fills. She found instead a steadier thing, the desire to build a life that would not be negotiated by those who saw people as tools. Her return had changed the Cole family. It had threatened their plans and exposed their vulnerabilities. It had also revealed how fragile systems of power are when confronted by a person who refuses to be moved like an object. She had entered their orbit as someone they thought they could buy. She had come back, not as a petitioner, but as a mother with the leverage of truth. The final scene sits at a window. Evelyn watches Leo asleep on the couch with a blanket over his knees and presses her hand to the small life inside her like an offer. She knows the future is not tidy. There will be hearings and whispers, offers and tests of loyalty. There will be those who hope to remove them, and there will be defenders who stand for their right to exist on their own terms. "Aren't you scared?" Leo asked her once, with the candid cruelty children can use. "Every day," she said, "but I'm not alone." She thought of the night she had woken with metal on her tongue and a note in her purse. She thought of the men on the roof, the van that had watched their building, the photo slipped under Leo's door. She thought of the dignity that had been offered as a bargaining chip and had refused to be bought. She thought, most of all, of the small certainty that a mother's love can be both vulnerable and ferocious. The House of Cole would heal and shift in public and private ways. It would continue to be a place of power, but power was no longer a monopoly. The ledger had been altered. The names written into it now included a woman who had once been erased and 3 unborn children who would always belong to themselves first. Evelyn had achieved what she had set out to do: create a space where her children's lives were not merely the property of a dynasty. There was no fairy tale ending. The empire had not collapsed. Sophia's vindictiveness still hummed in the wires of the city's gossip machine. Damian carried the weight of complicity and a fragile remorse. Daniel had been forced into a measure of humility. Evelyn had been forced into an orbit she had not chosen, but one she would use. On a cool evening, in a quiet kitchen that smelled of lemon and pancakes, Evelyn wrote in her journal, "We come back not to destroy, but to be seen." She closed the notebook carefully, like a woman closing a small, important door. Outside, the city glowed its indifferent lights. Inside, a mother watched both her son and the future she would fight for. If you want to follow what happens next, the fallouts, the alliances that will form, and the truth that keeps unfolding, watch the next episode in the saga.